The evening sun was setting over Maple Ridge, one of those quiet suburban neighborhoods where the houses were big and the lawns were perfectly cut. Dr. David Johnson was driving his black sedan through the winding streets, feeling tired but content after spending the afternoon with his mother. At 68, she still insisted on making his favorite apple pie whenever he visited, and today had been no different. David adjusted his rearview mirror and noticed the police car that had been following him for the past 3 blocks. He wasn't speeding, wasn't doing anything wrong, but something in his gut told him this wasn't going to end well. He'd been down this road before, literally and figuratively. The red and blue light suddenly flashed behind him, cutting through the peaceful evening like a knife. David sighed deeply and pulled over to the side of the road, his hands already moving to the steering wheel where they'd be visible. Years of experience had taught him exactly what to do in these situations. Officer Tony Blake stepped out of his patrol car with the kind of swagger that suggested he owned these streets. At 28, he'd been on the force for 5 years, and in his mind he knew how to spot trouble. A black man driving slowly through Maple Ridge at sunset, that was trouble waiting to happen. Blake approached the driver's side window, his hand resting casually on his belt. His eyes scanned the interior of the car, looking for anything suspicious. The driver was well-dressed, wearing a button-down shirt and tie, but that didn't mean much. Criminals came in all packages these days. David rolled down his window completely and kept his hands visible on the steering wheel. "Good evening, officer. Is there a problem?" Blake's eyes narrowed slightly. The guy was being polite, maybe too polite. In his experience, that usually meant someone was hiding something. "License and registration," he said, his tone leaving no room for pleasantries. "You know why I stopped you?" "No, sir, I don't," David replied honestly, reaching slowly for his glove compartment. "I was just visiting my mother and heading home." Blake watched every movement carefully. "Your mother, huh? She live around here?" There was skepticism in his voice, like he couldn't believe someone like David would have family in this neighborhood. David handed over his documents. "Yes, sir, she's lived on Oak Street for 30 years. House with the blue shutters." Blake took the license and looked at it suspiciously. The address showed David lived in the city, about 20 minutes away. "So you don't live here, but you're driving around real slow looking at houses. That seemed normal to you?" "I was just taking my time, officer. It's a beautiful neighborhood and I wasn't in any hurry to get home." David kept his voice calm and respectful, even though he could feel the familiar frustration building in his chest. "Uh-huh." Blake walked back to his patrol car to run the license. But he was already forming his own conclusions. In his 5 years on the force, he'd seen this pattern before. Someone casing houses looking for easy targets. The fact that this guy claimed to have family here was probably just a cover story. David waited in his car, watching Blake in the side mirror. He could see the officer talking on his radio, probably running his information. David's record was clean, of course. Not even a parking ticket in the past 5 years. But he knew that wouldn't matter much to someone who'd already made up his mind. Blake returned to the window, but this time his posture was even more aggressive. "Everything checks out," he said, though his tone suggested he wasn't happy about it. "But I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle." "Is that really necessary, officer? I haven't done anything wrong." "Step out of the vehicle." "Sir?" Blake's hand moved closer to his weapon, not quite touching it, but the message was clear. David complied, moving slowly and deliberately. He stood next to his car, hands visible, while Blake circled around him like a predator sizing up its prey. "So tell me again what you're doing in this neighborhood," Blake said, crossing his arms, "and this time try the truth." "I told you the truth, officer. I was visiting my mother. She made dinner, we talked, and now I'm going home." Blake shook his head. "See, here's what I think happened. I think you were driving around looking for houses to break into, maybe checking out cars to steal. Am I getting warm?" David felt his patience wearing thin, but he knew better than to let it show. "Officer, I understand you're just doing your job, but I really was just visiting family. If you'd like to call my mother, I'm sure she'd be happy to confirm it." "Your mother?" Blake laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Right. And I suppose she'll tell me all about her successful son who definitely wasn't casing the neighborhood." The conversation was taking an ugly turn, and David could see where this was heading. He'd dealt with officers like Blake before, men who saw his skin color first and everything else second, but this time felt different. This time Blake seemed almost eager for a confrontation. "Look, officer," David said, trying one more time to defuse the situation. "I know this might seem suspicious to you, but I promise you, I'm just a guy who visited his mother and is trying to get home to his family." Blake stepped closer, invading David's personal space. "You know what I think? I think you're full of it. I think you were up to no good, and now you're trying to talk your way out of it with this whole visiting mother story." David remained silent, knowing that anything he said at this point would only make things worse. Blake was clearly looking for a reason to escalate the situation, and David wasn't going to give him one. "You got anything illegal in that car?" Blake asked, already walking toward the vehicle. "Drugs, weapons? Stolen property?" "No, sir, I don't." "Well, we'll just see about that, won't we?" Blake peered through the windows looking for any excuse to search the vehicle. The car was spotless, nothing suspicious visible, but that didn't stop him from making a show of his inspection. David watched the officer's performance with growing concern. He'd been pulled over before, but never by someone so clearly determined to find trouble where none existed. Blake was acting like he'd already decided David was guilty of something and was just trying to figure out what. The evening air was cool, but David felt sweat beginning to form on his forehead. Not from fear, but from the effort of staying calm in the face of such obvious prejudice. He thought about his mother, probably wondering why he hadn't called to let her know he'd made it home safely. He thought about his wife and kids waiting for him to come home for dinner. Blake finished his inspection of the car and turned back to David with obvious disappointment. He'd found nothing, but his attitude suggested he wasn't ready to give up just yet. "All right," Blake said, putting his hands on his hips. "Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to search this vehicle top to bottom, and if I find anything at all, you're going to jail tonight." David looked at the officer calmly. "Do you have probable cause for a search, officer?" Blake's eyes flashed with anger. "Don't try to get smart with me, pal. I've got all the probable cause I need." The situation was spiraling out of control, and David knew he had to make a decision. He could continue to play along, hoping Blake would eventually realize he was wrong, or he could put an end to this charade once and for all. As Blake moved toward the car again, David made his choice. Officer Blake's frustration was growing by the minute. Here he was, face to face with someone he was convinced was up to no good, and the guy was acting like he had every right to be in this neighborhood. It didn't sit right with Blake, not one bit. "You know what your problem is?" Blake said, stepping closer to David. "You think you can just drive around wherever you want, acting like you belong here." David remained calm, though every word felt like a slap in the face. "I have every right to drive on public streets, officer. Public streets in a neighborhood where the average house costs $500,000, Blake shot back. "What do you do for work that you can afford to have family living here?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. David could hear the disbelief in Blake's voice. The assumption that someone who looked like him couldn't possibly have legitimate reasons for being in an upscale area. "I work for the government," David replied simply. Blake laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the quiet street. "Government work, huh? Let me guess, you're some kind of social worker? Maybe you work for the post office?" The condescension in Blake's voice was unmistakable. In his mind, he'd already categorized David into a neat little box labeled, "Doesn't belong here," and nothing David said was going to change that. "Something like that," David said, choosing not to elaborate. He'd learned over the years that giving too much information to hostile officers often made situations worse, not better. Blake walked around to the back of David's car, making a show of checking the license plate against his paperwork. "You know, I've been patrolling this area for 3 years now, and I know all the families that live here. I've never seen you before." "My mother is Mrs. Dorothy Johnson on Oak Street," David said patiently. "She's lived there since 1995. You can check with the neighbors if you'd like." "Mrs. Johnson." Blake seemed to consider this for a moment. "Old lady keeps to herself mostly?" "That's right." Blake's expression suggested he was putting pieces together, but not in the way David had hoped. "So you're telling me that sweet old lady is your mother, and you just happened to be visiting on the same day I catch you driving suspiciously through the neighborhood?" David felt a chill run down his spine. Blake wasn't just suspicious, he was actively hostile, and the mention of his mother seemed to have made things worse rather than better. "Officer, I visit my mother every Sunday," This isn't unusual or suspicious behavior. Every Sunday, huh? Blake pulled out his notepad and made a show of writing something down. And what time do these visits usually happen? I usually arrive around noon and leave between 6 and 7 in the evening. Blake looked at his watch dramatically. It's 7:15 right now. You're running a little late, aren't you? David realized he was in a no-win situation. Every answer he gave was being twisted into evidence of wrongdoing. If he'd left earlier, Blake probably would have said he was rushing to avoid being caught. Since he was leaving later, that was somehow suspicious too. We had a nice long visit today, David explained. Time got away from us. Time got away from you. Blake repeated the words like they tasted bad. Or maybe you were waiting for it to get dark so you could come back and break into some of these houses. The accusation was so outrageous that David actually took a step back. Officer, that's completely unfounded. I'm just trying to get home to my family. Your family? Blake's tone suggested he didn't believe David had a family either. Wife and kids, I suppose. Yes, sir. And they're just sitting at home waiting for Daddy to come back from his Sunday visit with Grandma? The sarcasm in Blake's voice was thick enough to cut with a knife. David felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his expression neutral. Yes, they are. Blake walked back to the front of the car and leaned against the hood, clearly settling in for a longer interrogation. You know what I think? I think you're feeding me a line of garbage from start to finish. I'm telling you the truth, officer. The truth? Blake stood up and walked closer again. The truth is that people like you don't have family in neighborhoods like this. The truth is that people like you don't just casually drive around here on Sunday evenings. There it was. People like you. The phrase that David had heard countless times throughout his life, always delivered with the same tone of barely concealed disgust. What exactly do you mean by people like me, officer? David asked quietly. Blake realized he'd said too much, but instead of backing down, he doubled down. You know exactly what I mean. Don't try to turn this into something it's not. I'm not trying to turn this into anything. I'm just asking for clarification. Blake's face was getting red now, a combination of embarrassment and anger. Don't get smart with me. I pulled you over for suspicious behavior, and everything you've told me since then has been one lie after another. I haven't lied about anything, officer. Haven't lied. Blake's voice was getting louder. You expect me to believe that you just happened to be visiting your mother in one of the nicest neighborhoods in the county? That you just happened to be driving around slowly, looking at houses for completely innocent reasons? David could see that Blake had worked himself into a state where logic and reason weren't going to penetrate. The officer had created a narrative in his mind, and he was determined to stick to it regardless of evidence to the contrary. Officer Blake, David said, reading the name tag on the man's uniform. I understand that you're trying to protect this neighborhood, and I respect that. But I'm not a threat to anyone here. Don't tell me how to do my job, Blake snapped. I've been protecting these streets since before you even knew this neighborhood existed. The implication was clear. David was an outsider who didn't belong, and Blake was the gatekeeper keeping undesirable elements out. I'm not trying to tell you how to do your job, David said. I'm just trying to explain that there's been a misunderstanding. Misunderstanding? Blake laughed again, that same harsh sound. The only misunderstanding here is you thinking you can talk your way out of this. David watched as Blake pulled out his radio. Control, this is Unit 12. I'm going to need backup at Oak and Maple. I've got a suspicious person who's being uncooperative. Uncooperative? David couldn't help but respond. Officer, I've answered every question you've asked and complied with every request. You've been argumentative and evasive since the moment I pulled you over, Blake said into his radio, loud enough for David to hear. Subject claims to have family in the area, but his story doesn't add up. David felt the situation slipping away from him. Blake was calling for backup and painting him as uncooperative, which would only make things worse when other officers arrived. He needed to de-escalate this quickly, but Blake seemed determined to escalate no matter what David said or did. Officer, please. David tried one more time. I'm not being argumentative. I'm just trying to answer your questions honestly. Blake ended his radio call and turned back to David with a look of triumph. Backup's on the way. Maybe they'll have better luck getting the truth out of you. The evening was growing darker and the streetlights were beginning to flicker on. David thought about his wife probably starting to worry, his kids wondering why Daddy was late for dinner. He thought about his mother who might look out her window and see police cars on her street. "This is really unnecessary, officer," David said. "I'm happy to provide any additional information you need to verify my identity or my reasons for being here." "Oh, you'll be providing plenty of information," Blake said with satisfaction. "Whether you want to or not." The sound of approaching sirens could be heard in the distance, and David knew he had only a few minutes before this situation became much more complicated. Officer Blake was pacing back and forth like a caged animal, clearly energized by the prospect of backup arriving to validate his suspicions. "You know what's going to happen when my partner gets here?" Blake said, stopping in front of David. "We're going to search your car, we're going to check your background, and we're going to find out what you're really up to." David took a deep breath. He'd hoped to avoid this conversation altogether, but Blake's hostility was leaving him with fewer options. "Officer Blake, I think there's something you should know about me." "Oh, here we go," Blake said with a smirk. "Now you're going to tell me you're some kind of big shot, right? Let me guess, you're a lawyer?" "No, I'm not a lawyer," David replied calmly. "But I do work in law enforcement." Blake's expression shifted slightly, confusion mixing with skepticism. "Law enforcement? What kind of law enforcement?" "I'm a federal agent," David said simply. "And I have a doctorate in criminal psychology." For a moment, Blake was speechless. Then he threw his head back and laughed so hard that a few neighbors' porch lights began turning on. "A federal agent," Blake gasped between laughs. "Oh, that's rich. And let me guess, you got your PhD from Harvard or Yale?" "Actually, I got it from Georgetown University," David said matter-of-factly. Blake's laughter became even more hysterical. "Georgetown? Oh man, this just keeps getting better. Next you're going to tell me you work for the FBI or something." David remained silent, which only seemed to amuse Blake more. "You actually expect me to believe," Blake said, wiping tears from his eyes, "that someone like you has a PhD? From Georgetown University? And works as a federal agent? Why is that so hard to believe?" David asked quietly. Blake's laughter stopped abruptly. "Because I wasn't born yesterday, that's why. You think I don't know how the system works? You think I don't know about quotas and handouts?" The words hit David like a physical blow. He'd heard variations of this his entire career, but it never got easier. "You want to know what I think happened?" Blake continued, his voice dripping with contempt. "I think somebody felt sorry for you. I think somebody decided they needed to check a box, fill a quota, look good for the cameras, so they handed you a degree you didn't earn and gave you a job you don't deserve." David felt his hands clench into fists at his sides, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Officer, you don't know anything about my qualifications or how I earned my position, don't I?" Blake stepped closer, his voice getting louder. "Let me tell you what I know. I know that real agents, real PhD holders don't end up getting pulled over for suspicious behavior in suburban neighborhoods. They don't drive around slowly, casing houses like common criminals. I wasn't casing houses," David said through gritted teeth. "And I know," Blake continued, ignoring David's denial, "that the system is rigged these days. Standards get lowered, requirements get waived, all in the name of diversity and inclusion." The sirens were getting closer now, and Blake seemed to be working himself into a frenzy before his backup arrived. "You probably can't even spell psychology, let alone have a doctorate in it," Blake taunted. "But hey, as long as you check the right demographic boxes, who cares about actual qualifications, right?" David had spent 15 years in federal law enforcement, had solved cases that made national headlines, had testified before Congress on criminal behavior patterns. He'd published papers in academic journals, lectured at universities, and trained other agents. But none of that mattered to Blake, who saw only skin color and made assumptions accordingly. "Officer," David said, his voice steady despite his growing anger, "I've worked very hard for everything I've achieved in my career." "Worked hard?" Blake scoffed. "At what? Showing up and looking the part? Playing the role they needed you to play?" The first police car pulled up behind Blake's patrol vehicle, its blue and red lights adding to the chaos of the scene. Blake turned to wave at his colleague, a satisfied grin spreading across his face. "Perfect timing," Blake called out. "Wait until you hear this guy's story. Claims he's a federal agent with a PhD. Officer Rodriguez stepped out of his car, a 20-year veteran who'd seen enough situations to know when something wasn't right. He approached cautiously, his eyes taking in the scene. "What's the situation here, Blake?" Rodriguez asked. "Caught this guy driving suspiciously through the neighborhood," Blake explained excitedly. "When I questioned him, He started spinning this elaborate story about visiting his mother and working for the government. Then when I pressed him, he claimed to be a federal agent with a doctorate. Rodriguez looked at David, who stood quietly beside his car with his hands visible. Something about the man's demeanor didn't match Blake's description of a suspicious character. "Sir, is that correct?" Rodriguez asked David directly. "Are you claiming to be a federal agent?" "I'm not claiming anything," David replied calmly. "I am a federal agent," Blake burst into laughter again. "See what I mean? Guy's completely delusional. Probably thinks if he keeps saying it, we'll believe him." Rodriguez frowned. In his 20 years on the force, he'd learned to trust his instincts, and something about this situation felt off. Blake was acting more aggressively than usual, and the man he'd stopped seemed remarkably calm for someone who was supposedly lying about his identity. "Blake, did you run his license?" Rodriguez asked. "Of course I ran it. Came back clean, but that doesn't mean anything. Probably just means he hasn't been caught yet." Rodriguez walked over to David. "Sir, do you have any identification that would support your claim about being a federal agent?" David nodded slowly.
"Yes, officer, I do."
"But I'd like to reach for it slowly, if that's all right." "Go ahead," Rodriguez said, while Blake watched with obvious skepticism. David reached into his jacket pocket, moving deliberately and keeping his other hand visible. Blake tensed, expecting some kind of trick or distraction. "This should be good," Blake muttered. "Probably has a fake ID he bought online." David pulled out a leather wallet and opened it carefully. Inside, clearly visible, was his federal credentials and badge. Rodriguez stepped closer to examine the identification, while Blake continued his commentary. "Come on, Rodriguez. You don't actually believe that's real, do you? Anyone can buy a fake badge these days. Look at the guy. Does he look like a federal agent to you?" But Rodriguez was studying the credentials carefully, and his expression was changing. The badge looked authentic, the ID was professionally made, and the holographic security features appeared genuine. "Blake," Rodriguez said quietly, "I think you need to see this." "See what? His fake ID?" Blake walked over dismissively, but when he looked at the badge, his confident expression faltered slightly. "That's obviously a fake," Blake said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. David watched the two officers examine his credentials, knowing that this moment would determine how the rest of the evening played out. He'd been in situations like this before, but never with an officer as hostile as Blake. "The serial numbers check out," Rodriguez said quietly to Blake. "And look at the quality of this badge. This isn't something you buy online." Blake's face was beginning to flush red again, but this time it wasn't from anger. It was from the growing realization that he might have made a serious mistake. The evening air seemed to grow thick with tension as Officer Rodriguez continued examining David's federal credentials. Blake stood beside him, his earlier confidence cracking like ice under pressure. The badge wasn't just authentic looking. It was absolutely genuine, with all the proper security features and serial numbers that only real federal agencies could produce. "Special Agent David Johnson," Rodriguez read aloud from the identification. "Federal Bureau of Investigation, Criminal Psychology Division." Blake's face went from red to pale in a matter of seconds. The words seemed to echo in the quiet suburban street, each syllable hitting him like a hammer blow. He'd spent the last 20 minutes accusing an FBI agent of being a criminal, mocking his education, and questioning his right to exist in this neighborhood. That can't be right," Blake stammered, reaching for the credentials himself. His hands were shaking slightly as he examined the badge that he'd been so certain was fake just moments before. David watched Blake's reaction with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. He'd seen this look before, the moment when someone's prejudices collided headfirst with reality. It wasn't pleasant for anyone involved, but it was necessary. "I'm afraid it's very real, officer," David said quietly, "just like my doctorate from Georgetown University." Rodriguez stepped back, his 20 years of experience telling him that this situation had just become exponentially more complicated. He'd worked with federal agents before, and he knew they didn't take kindly to being harassed by local police. "Sir, I apologize for any inconvenience," Rodriguez said professionally. "Is there anything we can do to resolve this situation?" Blake was still staring at the badge, his mind racing as he tried to process what this meant for his career, his future, his life. He'd not only stopped a federal agent without cause, but he'd verbally abused him, questioned his credentials, and called for backup as if he were dealing with a dangerous criminal. I was just doing my job," Blake said weakly, but even he could hear how hollow the words sounded. David took his credentials back and placed them carefully in his jacket pocket. Officer Blake, I need you to understand something. In the last 20 minutes, you've accused me of casing houses for burglary, suggested I was carrying drugs or weapons, and claimed that my PhD was unearned because of my race. Blake opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. Everything David was saying was true, and they all knew it. You made assumptions about me based on nothing more than the color of my skin and the neighborhood I was driving through, David continued, his voice remaining calm but carrying unmistakable authority. That's not police work, officer. That's profiling. Rodriguez looked at his colleague with growing concern. Blake had always been aggressive, but this was beyond anything Rodriguez had witnessed before. The young officer had potentially destroyed his career in a single traffic stop. Agent Johnson, Rodriguez said carefully, what would you like us to do from here? David considered the question for a moment. He could make Blake's life very difficult with a single phone call. Federal agents had considerable power when it came to filing complaints against local officers, and Blake's behavior had been egregious enough to warrant serious consequences. First, David said, I want to make it clear that this entire interaction has been recorded. Blake's face went white. Recorded? David pointed to his car's dashboard. Dash camera, officer. Everything you've said and done for the past 20 minutes is on video. Standard FBI vehicle equipment. Blake felt like the ground was falling out from under him. Not only had he harassed a federal agent, but there was video evidence of everything he'd said and done. Additionally, David continued, I have a body camera of my own. He pointed to a small device clipped to his shirt. Department policy requires agents to record all law enforcement interactions when off duty. Rodriguez closed his eyes briefly. He'd tried to mentor Blake, tried to teach him that good police work was about building community trust, not about confrontation and intimidation. But Blake had never listened, and now his aggressive approach had finally caught up with him. Sir, Rodriguez said to David, Officer Blake is relatively new to the force. I'm sure he didn't mean Officer Rodriguez, David interrupted gently. I appreciate your loyalty to your colleague, but let's not pretend this was a simple misunderstanding. Officer Blake made it very clear what he thought of me and people who look like me. Blake finally found his voice again, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. Agent Johnson, I made a mistake. I was just trying to protect the neighborhood. Protect it from what exactly? David asked. From a man visiting his elderly mother? From someone driving legally on public streets? Or were you trying to protect it from people who look like me? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Blake knew that anything he said would only make the situation worse, but his silence was damning in its own way. David pulled out his cell phone. I'm going to need to make a few calls. First to my supervisor, then to your department's internal affairs division. Wait, Blake said desperately. Please, can we talk about this? I have a family, a mortgage. I can't lose my job over this. David looked at him with something that might have been pity. Officer Blake, you should have thought about your family before you decided to harass an innocent citizen based on his race. Rodriguez stepped forward. Agent Johnson, is there any way we can handle this internally? Blake's learned his lesson, I'm sure of it. Have you? David asked Blake directly. Have you really learned your lesson? Or are you just sorry you got caught? Blake struggled to find words that might save his career. I realize I made some assumptions. That was wrong of me. Some assumptions? David's voice carried a note of disbelief. Officer, you accused me of being a criminal, suggested my education was unearned, and treated me like a threat to public safety. Those weren't assumptions, they were prejudices. The sound of another police car approaching filled the silence. Blake had called for additional backup earlier, and now more officers were arriving to witness his humiliation. Sergeant Williams stepped out of the new patrol car, a 30-year veteran who commanded respect throughout the department. He took one look at the scene, Blake looking like he'd seen a ghost, Rodriguez trying to manage damage control, and a well-dressed black man standing calmly beside an expensive sedan, and knew immediately that something had gone very wrong. What's the situation here? Williams asked, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades in law enforcement. Rodriguez quickly filled him in on the basics. Blake had stopped David for suspicious behavior. David had identified himself as an FBI agent, and the credentials had checked out as authentic. Williams walked over to David and extended his hand. "Agent Johnson, I'm Sergeant Williams. I apologize for any inconvenience our officers may have caused you." David shook the sergeant's hand. "Sergeant Williams, I wish I could say this was just an inconvenience, but I'm afraid it was quite a bit more than that." Williams looked at Blake, who was still standing there looking like he wanted to disappear into the pavement. "Officer Blake, why don't you return to your vehicle while I sort this out?" Blake started to protest, but Williams cut him off with a look. "Now, officer." As Blake walked away, Williams turned back to David. "Agent Johnson, I've been doing this for 30 years, and I can usually tell when one of my officers has stepped over the line. What happened here tonight?" David appreciated the sergeant's direct approach. "Your officer stopped me without probable cause, accused me of criminal behavior, and when I mentioned my education and career, he suggested that I didn't deserve either because of my race." Williams winced. He'd feared it was something like this, but hearing it confirmed made his stomach turn. "And you have this on video?" "Every word," David confirmed. Sergeant Williams felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach as he processed what Agent Johnson had just told him. In 30 years of police work, he'd seen careers destroyed by moments of poor judgment. But this situation had the potential to be much worse than just one officer's mistake. This could become a department-wide scandal. "Agent Johnson," Williams said carefully, "I need to ask you directly, are you planning to file a formal complaint about this incident?" David looked at the sergeant for a long moment. Williams seemed like a decent man, someone who genuinely cared about doing the right thing. But David had been down this road before, and he knew that good intentions didn't always translate into meaningful consequences. "Sergeant, I've been a federal agent for 15 years, David said. "I've worked with police departments across the country, and I understand the challenges you face. But what happened here tonight went far beyond acceptable police conduct." Williams nodded grimly. "I understand, sir. And I want you to know that this kind of behavior doesn't represent our department's values." "Doesn't it?" David asked quietly, because Officer Blake seemed very comfortable with his approach. This didn't feel like someone having a bad day or making a single mistake. This felt like someone expressing views he's held for a long time. From his patrol car, Blake watched the conversation between Williams and Agent Johnson with growing panic. He couldn't hear what they were saying, but their body language told him everything he needed to know. His career was over, and probably his life as he knew it. Blake pulled out his cell phone with shaking hands and called his wife. "Hey, honey," Lisa answered cheerfully. "How's your shift going?" Blake struggled to find words. How do you tell your pregnant wife that you might have just destroyed your family's future? "Lisa, I think I'm in trouble." "What kind of trouble? Are you hurt?" "No, I'm not hurt. But I made a mistake tonight." "A big mistake?" The cheerfulness left Lisa's voice immediately. "Tony, what did you do?" Blake looked out at Agent Johnson and Sergeant Williams, still deep in conversation. "I stopped someone tonight, and it turns out he's an FBI agent, and I might have said some things I shouldn't have said." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Lisa knew her husband's temper, knew his views about certain people, and she'd worried before that his attitude would get him in trouble. "How bad is it?" she asked finally. "Pretty bad," Blake admitted. "I think I'm going to lose my job." Meanwhile, Rodriguez had approached Sergeant Williams and Agent Johnson, carrying a tablet computer. "Sergeant," Rodriguez said quietly, "I ran Agent Johnson's credentials through the federal database. Everything checks out. He's not just any federal agent, he's a decorated investigator with commendations from multiple agencies." Williams looked at the screen, which showed David's impressive record of service, multiple successful cases, several awards for excellence, and a spotless personnel record stretching back 15 years. "Dr. Johnson," Williams said, reading from the screen, "it says here you have a PhD in criminal psychology, and you've published research on police-community relations." David nodded. "I've spent a significant portion of my career studying exactly the kind of interaction we had here tonight." The irony wasn't lost on any of them. Blake hadn't just harassed a random citizen. He'd harassed someone whose job it was to study and prevent exactly this type of police misconduct. "Agent Johnson," Williams said, "I need to be completely honest with you. This incident is going to have serious consequences for Officer Blake, and potentially for our entire department." "I understand that, Sergeant, but I can't let what happened here tonight go unreported." Too many people have suffered from this kind of treatment and they didn't have a badge to protect them. Williams appreciated David's honesty. A lesser man might have used his federal authority to intimidate or threaten, but Agent Johnson was handling the situation with remarkable professionalism. "What do you need from us right now?" Williams asked. "I need copies of all dashcam footage from tonight," David said. "I need the names and badge numbers of everyone who responded to this scene. And I need to know what your department's policy is for handling civil rights violations." Rodriguez winced. David wasn't just filing a complaint. He was building a federal case, of course, Williams said. "Rodriguez, get Agent Johnson everything he's requested. And call Chief Martinez. He needs to know about this situation immediately." As Rodriguez walked away to make the call, Williams turned back to David. "Agent Johnson, off the record, what are you hoping to accomplish here?" David appreciated the question. "Sergeant, I'm not trying to destroy your department or ruin Officer Blake's life out of spite. But this kind of behavior has to have consequences, or it will continue to happen to people who don't have the protection of a federal badge." "I understand," Williams said, "and for what it's worth, I agree with you. Blake's been a problem for a while now. We've had complaints before, but nothing we could prove." "Other complaints?" David's eyebrows raised. "What kind of complaints?" Williams hesitated, knowing he was probably saying too much. But Agent Johnson was going to find out anyway once the investigation began. Excessive force complaints, allegations of racial profiling, nothing that resulted in formal discipline but enough to establish a pattern. David felt his anger rising again. Blake wasn't just having a bad night. He was a repeat offender who'd been allowed to continue his behavior because previous victims hadn't had the power to force accountability. "How many complaints?" David asked. 7 in the past 2 years, Williams admitted. "We've provided additional training, counseling, everything short of suspension. And it didn't work. Obviously not." Rodriguez returned with his tablet. "Chief Martinez is on his way," he reported. "ETA about 10 minutes. He wants to speak with Agent Johnson personally." David nodded. "I'll wait for him." Blake was still in his patrol car, trying to explain to his wife how their carefully planned future had just been derailed by his own actions. Lisa was crying now, thinking about their unborn child and the house they'd just bought and the life they'd been building together. "Maybe it won't be as bad as you think," Lisa said through her tears. "Maybe you can apologize and they'll give you another chance." Blake looked out at Agent Johnson, still standing calmly beside his car despite having been humiliated and mistreated. The man showed no signs of anger or vindictiveness, but Blake knew that didn't matter. Some lines, once crossed, couldn't be uncrossed. "I don't think an apology is going to fix this," Blake said quietly. Sergeant Williams approached David again. "Agent Johnson, while we're waiting for the chief, is there anything else you need? Can we call anyone for you?" David looked at his watch. It was almost 8 o'clock and his family would be wondering where he was. "Actually, could I use your phone to call my wife? I should let her know I'll be late." "Of course." Williams handed him his cell phone. David dialed home and his wife Jennifer answered on the first ring. "David, where are you?" "Dinner's getting cold. I'm sorry, honey. I got pulled over on my way home from Mom's and it's turned into a bit of a situation." Jennifer's voice immediately filled with concern. "Are you okay?" "What kind of situation?" "I'm fine," David assured her. "But I think I'm going to be here for a while longer. Don't wait up for me." "David, you're scaring me. What happened?" David looked around at the 3 police cars, the flashing lights, and Officer Blake sitting alone in his patrol car. "I'll explain everything when I get home. But right now I need to see this through." After ending the call, David handed the phone back to Williams. In the distance, they could see the headlights of another vehicle approaching. Chief Martinez, coming to assess the damage and figure out how to contain what was about to become the biggest scandal his department had faced in years. Chief Martinez arrived at the scene like a man heading to his own execution. At 55, he'd spent 30 years building his reputation as a fair and progressive police chief, working hard to build trust between his department and the community. Now, in a single evening, one officer's actions threatened to undo decades of progress. He stepped out of his unmarked vehicle and immediately assessed the situation. 3 patrol cars with flashing lights, his officers looking uncomfortable, and a well-dressed black man standing calmly beside a sedan, the man who held his department's reputation in his hands. "Agent Johnson?" Martinez approached with his hand extended. I'm Chief Martinez. I want to personally apologize for what happened here tonight. David shook the chief's hand, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact. Chief Martinez, I appreciate you coming out personally. When one of my officers stops an FBI agent under questionable circumstances, that requires my immediate attention, Martinez said. Sergeant Williams has filled me in on the basics, but I'd like to hear your version of events. David spent the next 10 minutes recounting the entire interaction, from the initial traffic stop through Blake's escalating hostility and racist comments. Martinez listened without interruption, his expression growing darker with each detail. And you have all of this on video? Martinez asked when David finished. Every word, David confirmed, both from my vehicle's dash camera and my personal body camera. Martinez turned to Sergeant Williams. Have we secured all the footage from our vehicles?
Rodriguez is handling that now, Williams replied.
We'll have everything ready for review within the hour. Good. Martinez turned back to David. Agent Johnson, I want you to know that this behavior is absolutely not tolerated in my department. Officer Blake will face serious consequences for his actions. David appreciated the chief's directness, but he'd heard similar promises before. Chief, what kind of consequences are we talking about? Martinez chose his words carefully. That will depend on what our internal investigation reveals, but based on what you've told me, I expect Officer Blake will be suspended pending a full review. If the evidence supports your account, he'll likely face termination. And what about the fact that this apparently isn't his first incident? David asked. Martinez's jaw tightened. He'd hoped Agent Johnson didn't know about Blake's previous complaints, but there was no point in pretending otherwise. You're aware of the other complaints? Sergeant Williams mentioned there had been 7 complaints in 2 years, David said. That suggests a pattern of behavior, not an isolated incident. Martinez felt like he was walking through a minefield. Every word he said could potentially be used against his department in a federal investigation. Agent Johnson, I won't lie to you. Officer Blake has been a problem, and we should have acted more decisively earlier. That's on me as much as it's on him. David was surprised by the chief's honesty. Most police administrators would have tried to deflect responsibility or minimize their officer's history. Why wasn't he terminated after previous complaints? David asked. Because we couldn't prove the allegations, Martinez admitted. The complaints were he said, she said situations without video evidence or witnesses. Tonight is different because we have you, a credible federal agent, and video proof of his conduct. Rodriguez approached the group carrying a laptop computer. Chief, I've got all the dash cam footage queued up if you want to review it. Martinez looked at David. Agent Johnson, would you mind if we watch this together? I want to make sure we're all seeing the same thing. David nodded and the group gathered around the laptop. Rodriguez hit play, and they watched the entire 20-minute interaction unfold on screen. The footage was even more damning than David's description had suggested. Blake's hostility was obvious from the beginning. His racist assumptions were clearly audible, and his mockery of David's education was particularly ugly when heard a second time. When the video ended, Martinez was visibly shaken. Jesus Christ, he muttered, then caught himself. I'm sorry, Agent Johnson. I've seen a lot of bad police work in my career, but this is inexcusable. Sergeant Williams was staring at the laptop screen in disgust. I can't believe he said those things about your PhD. That was completely out of line. David watched the 3 officers' reactions with interest. They all seemed genuinely horrified by Blake's behavior, which gave him some hope that this incident might lead to meaningful change. Chief, David said, I need to ask you something directly. Are you planning to handle this internally, or are you going to involve outside oversight? Martinez knew this was the crucial question. How he answered would determine whether this remained a local personnel matter or became a federal investigation that could destroy careers and budgets. Agent Johnson, I believe in accountability and transparency. If you want to file a federal complaint, that's your right, and I won't try to discourage you. But I'm also going to conduct a thorough internal investigation regardless. What would an internal investigation involve? Full review of Blake's entire career, interviews with everyone who's worked with him, examination of all previous complaints, and a comprehensive review of our training and supervision protocols. David appreciated the thoroughness of Martinez's proposed investigation, but he knew internal reviews often protected officers rather than punishing them. And if your investigation concludes that Officer Blake violated my civil rights, Then he'll be terminated immediately, and will refer the case to the district attorney for criminal prosecution. Rodriguez's radio crackled to life. Unit 12. We need you to respond to a domestic disturbance on Elm Street. Everyone turned to look at Blake's patrol car, where he was still sitting and talking on his cell phone. Blake's not responding to calls tonight, Martinez said firmly. Rodriguez, you and Williams handle that call. I want Blake to return to the station immediately. As the two officers prepared to leave, Martinez pulled Williams aside. Tom, I want you to write up a detailed report of everything that happened here tonight. Don't leave anything out. Yes, sir. And Tom, I want you to be honest about any concerns you've had about Blake's conduct in the past. This is bigger than protecting one officer now. Williams nodded grimly. He tried to mentor Blake, tried to teach him better ways to do the job, but the young officer had never listened. Now Williams's failure to speak up earlier might have contributed to this disaster. After the other officers left, Martinez turned back to David. Agent Johnson, can I speak candidly with you? Of course. This incident is going to be a major problem for my department, and frankly, we deserve whatever consequences come from it. But I'm hoping we can work together to use this as an opportunity for real reform. David was intrigued. What kind of reform? Complete overhaul of our training programs, new policies on traffic stops and interactions with the public, maybe even bringing in outside consultants to review our entire approach to community policing. And you think one incident is going to drive that kind of change? Martinez looked at the laptop, which was still displaying the final frame of Blake's humiliation. Agent Johnson, I've been trying to implement reforms for years, but I've always faced resistance from officers who thought things were fine the way they were. This video is going to make it impossible for anyone to argue that our current approach is working. David considered the chief's words. He could file a federal complaint, which would likely result in a lengthy investigation and eventual settlement. Or he could try to work with Martinez to create lasting change that might prevent future incidents. Chief, what exactly are you proposing? I'm proposing that we use your expertise, Martinez said. You're a PhD in criminal psychology who studies police-community relations. Help us rebuild our training programs. Help us create policies that prevent this kind of behavior. Help us become the kind of department that communities can trust. It was an interesting offer, but David knew it came with risks. If he agreed to work with the department, he might be seen as letting Blake off too easily. If he declined and filed a federal complaint, he might miss an opportunity to create meaningful change. I'll need to think about it, David said finally. Of course, but Agent Johnson, I want you to know that Officer Blake's career in law enforcement is over regardless of what you decide. That's not negotiable. The news broke 3 days later, not through official channels, but through a cell phone video that someone had taken from their bedroom window. The footage was grainy and the audio was unclear, but it clearly showed a black man being questioned by multiple police officers on Oak Street in Maple Ridge. Within hours, the video was everywhere. Social media exploded with speculation about what had happened. Local news stations picked up the story. Community activists began asking questions that the police department wasn't ready to answer. David was in his FBI office when his supervisor, Assistant Director Patricia Walsh, knocked on his door. David, we need to talk, she said, closing the door behind her. I just got off the phone with Chief Martinez. He told me about what happened Sunday night. David looked up from his case files. I was planning to brief you this afternoon. This is a mess, David. A local police officer harassing one of our agents? This is going to be front-page news by tomorrow. David had been dreading this conversation. While he'd been focused on the justice aspects of the situation, he knew his supervisor would be thinking about the political implications. Patricia, I followed protocol. I identified myself as soon as it was safe to do so. I documented everything and I reported it through proper channels. I'm not questioning your actions, Walsh said, sitting down across from his desk. But this story is going to get bigger before it gets smaller. The media loves stories about racist cops, and when the victim is an FBI agent, it becomes national news. David's phone buzzed with a text message from his wife. Channel 7 is here. They want to interview you about Sunday night. They're already at my house, David said, showing Walsh the message. Of course they are. Walsh rubbed her temples. David, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Are you planning to go public with this? David had been wrestling with this question for 3 days. He could handle this quietly through official channels, or he could use the media attention to shine a spotlight on the broader issues of police misconduct and racial profiling. I haven't decided yet, David said honestly, because if you do go public, you need to understand that you'll become the face of this story. Every interview, every article, every discussion about police reform will include your name and your face. Are you prepared for that? David thought about his family, his career, his mother living in the neighborhood where this all happened. Going public would change everything for all of them. Patricia, can I ask you something? In your opinion, if I stay quiet, what happens to Officer Blake? Walsh considered the question. He'll probably be fired, maybe face some minor charges, but in 6 months this will all be forgotten, and officers like him will continue doing what they've always done. And if I go public? Then this becomes a bigger conversation about police accountability, racial profiling, and civil rights. It might lead to real changes, but it will also make you and your family targets for every racist with an internet connection. David's desk phone rang. The caller ID showed it was his mother. David, honey, there are news vans on my street, Dorothy Johnson said when he answered. Mrs. Peterson next door says they're asking about what happened Sunday night. What should I tell them? David felt a surge of anger. His elderly mother shouldn't have to deal with reporters camping out on her street because of Officer Blake's actions. Mom, don't talk to any reporters. I'll handle this. But David, what happened? You never told me about any trouble on Sunday. David looked at Walsh, who was listening to his side of the conversation. Mom, I'll come over tonight and explain everything. Just don't open the door for any reporters, okay? After hanging up, David turned back to his supervisor. They're harassing my mother now. Unfortunately, that's what happens when these stories break, Walsh said. The media circus becomes part of the story itself. David's computer chimed with an email notification. The subject line read, Interview request, 60 minutes. Jesus, David muttered. 60 Minutes wants to interview me. Walsh leaned forward. David, you need to make a decision. Either we get ahead of this story and control the narrative, or we let others define what happened. Before David could respond, his cell phone rang. The caller ID showed Chief Martinez. Agent Johnson, I'm calling to give you a heads up, Martinez said when David answered. The story's broken locally, and we're getting calls from national media. I wanted you to know before you heard it from someone else. How bad is it? David asked. Bad. The video from Sunday night is all over social media, and people are demanding answers. I'm holding a press conference this afternoon to address the situation. What are you going to say? Martinez paused. That depends on what you want me to say. If you're planning to speak publicly about this, I need to coordinate with you so we're not contradicting each other. David looked at Walsh, who was making urgent hand gestures suggesting he shouldn't commit to anything over the phone. Chief, I'm still considering my options. Can you hold off on the press conference until we can talk? I can delay it until this evening, but that's about it. The mayor's office is breathing down my neck, and the city council wants answers. After ending the call, David sat back in his chair. The decision was being made for him by events beyond his control. Patricia, what would the Bureau prefer I do? Walsh was quiet for a long moment. Officially, the Bureau supports your right to speak publicly about civil rights violations. Unofficially, we'd prefer this didn't become a national incident that makes every police department in the country suspicious of working with federal agents. David understood the dilemma. The FBI needed good working relationships with local police departments to do their job effectively. But they also couldn't be seen as tolerating the abuse of their own agents. What if I spoke publicly but focused on the broader issues rather than the personal details? David asked. What do you mean? What if I used this as an opportunity to talk about police training, community relations, and reform? Make it about solutions rather than just pointing fingers? Walsh considered this approach. That might work. You'd be seen as taking the high road, focusing on constructive change rather than revenge. David's phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from his wife. The kids are asking why there are cameras outside our house. What should I tell them? David felt the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. His 8-year-old daughter and 10-year-old son shouldn't have to deal with media attention because of someone else's prejudice. "Patricia, I've made my decision," David said finally. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to speak publicly, but I'm going to do it on my terms. I want to hold a joint press conference with Chief Martinez. I want to talk about what happened, but more importantly, I want to talk about what we're going to do to make sure it doesn't happen again." Walsh nodded slowly. "That could work. It shows you're not just trying to destroy the police department, but that you're willing to work toward solutions." David picked up his phone to call Martinez back. "Chief, I've made a decision about going public." "I'm listening." "I want to hold a joint press conference. We'll both speak about what happened, but we'll focus on the steps we're taking to prevent future incidents." Martinez was quiet for a moment. "You're willing to appear publicly with me after what my officer did to you?" "Chief, I'm not interested in destroying your department. I'm interested in fixing the problems that allowed this to happen in the first place. Agent Johnson, if you're willing to do that, it would mean everything to me and to this department." David looked out his office window at the city below. Somewhere out there, Officer Blake was probably wondering if his career was over. Somewhere else, another person was probably being pulled over by a police officer who saw skin color before humanity. "Let's schedule it for tomorrow morning," David said. "That will give us time to coordinate our messages and prepare for the questions we're going to get." As David hung up the phone, Walsh stood to leave. "David, are you sure about this? Once you do that press conference, there's no going back." David thought about his mother dealing with reporters, his children asking difficult questions, and all the people who didn't have federal badges to protect them from officers like Blake. "Patricia, I became an FBI agent to protect people who can't protect themselves. This is just another way of doing that job." The press conference was held at 10 a.m. on a Thursday morning in the main conference room of the Maple Ridge Police Department. Local and national media filled every available seat, with cameras from major networks broadcasting live to millions of viewers across the country. Chief Martinez stepped to the podium first, looking like a man who had aged years in just a few days. His prepared statement was direct and unflinching. "On Sunday evening, one of our officers conducted a traffic stop that violated every principle of professional policing and human decency," Martinez began. "Officer Tony Blake stopped FBI agent David Johnson without probable cause, subjected him to racial profiling, and made comments that were both unprofessional and offensive." The room was silent except for the clicking of cameras and the scratching of pens on paper. "Officer Blake has been terminated from this department effective immediately," Martinez continued. "We have also referred this case to the district attorney's office for potential criminal prosecution." Martinez paused and looked directly into the cameras. "But terminating one officer is not enough. This incident has forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about our training, our culture, and our commitment to serving all members of our community." He then introduced David, who approached the podium with the calm confidence that had served him well throughout his career. "Thank you, Chief Martinez," David began. "I want to start by saying that I'm not here today as a victim. I'm here as someone who has dedicated his career to understanding and preventing exactly the kind of interaction that occurred on Sunday evening." David looked out at the sea of reporters and cameras. "What happened to me was wrong, but it wasn't unique. Every day, citizens across this country are subjected to the same kind of treatment I experienced. But they don't have federal badges to protect them." He paused to let that sink in before continuing. "Officer Blake saw my skin color and made assumptions about who I was, what I was doing, and whether I belonged in that neighborhood. Those assumptions led him to treat me not as a citizen deserving of respect, but as a threat to be contained." A reporter raised her hand. "Agent Johnson, are you planning to sue the department?" David had anticipated this question. "My goal isn't financial compensation. My goal is systemic change that will prevent other families from experiencing what my family has been through this week." "What kind of change are you talking about?" another reporter asked. David gestured to Martinez, who stepped back to the podium. "Agent Johnson has agreed to work with our department to completely overhaul our training programs," Martinez announced. "We're implementing new policies for traffic stops, enhanced training on implicit bias, and regular community engagement initiatives. Furthermore, Martinez continued, we're establishing a civilian oversight board with real authority to investigate complaints and recommend discipline. And we're partnering with local universities to conduct ongoing research on police-community relations. David returned to the microphone. These aren't just policy changes on paper. Chief Martinez has committed to measurable outcomes, reduced complaint rates, improved community satisfaction scores, and regular public reporting on our progress. A reporter from CNN raised her hand. Agent Johnson, some critics might say you're being too easy on a department that allowed this officer to remain on the force despite multiple complaints. What's your response? David had thought carefully about this question. I could have handled this through federal courts and lawsuits. But lawsuits don't change hearts and minds. Training does. Accountability does. Building relationships between police and communities does. Chief Martinez, called out a reporter from the local newspaper. What happened to the officers who failed to act on previous complaints about Officer Blake? Martinez's jaw tightened. We're conducting a comprehensive review of how those complaints were handled. Any supervisor who failed to take appropriate action will face disciplinary measures up to and including termination. After the press conference, David and Martinez sat in the chief's office, both exhausted from the media scrutiny. Agent Johnson, I want you to know that Blake received his termination letter this morning, Martinez said. His police certification is being revoked, which means he'll never work in law enforcement again. David nodded. What about the criminal charges? The DA is reviewing the case. At minimum, Blake will face federal civil rights violations. Depending on what they find, there could be additional charges. David's phone buzzed with a text from his wife. Saw the press conference. I'm proud of you. Chief, I want to make something clear, David said. This partnership we're talking about isn't going to be easy. Real reform means changing a culture that's been in place for decades. I understand, Martinez replied. But Agent Johnson, you've given us something we didn't have before this incident. What's that? Credibility. When you stand next to us and say we're committed to change, people believe it. Without your support, we'd just be another police department making empty promises after a scandal. 3 months later, the Maple Ridge Police Department had become a model for police reform. Officer recruitment focused on community-oriented candidates. Training programs emphasized de-escalation and cultural sensitivity. Monthly town halls gave residents direct access to police leadership. David found himself traveling across the country, speaking at police academies and community forums about building trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve. But the most meaningful moment came on a Sunday evening, 6 months after the original incident. David was once again leaving his mother's house after dinner when he was pulled over for a burned-out taillight. The officer who approached his car was young, probably new to the force. But his demeanor was professional. His questions were respectful, and he treated David exactly as he would treat any other citizen. License and registration, please, sir, the officer said politely. I noticed your taillight is out. Just wanted to make sure you were aware of it. Thank you, officer, David replied, handing over his documents. I hadn't noticed. The officer checked David's license and returned it promptly. Everything looks good, Dr. Johnson. There's an auto parts store about 2 miles down the road if you want to get that bulb replaced tonight. I appreciate that, officer. Have a safe evening. As David drove away, he thought about the contrast between this interaction and the one 6 months earlier. The officer had been courteous, efficient, and professional. He'd called David Dr. Johnson after seeing his license, showing respect for his education rather than mocking it. It was a small moment, but it represented something larger. Change was possible when people were willing to confront uncomfortable truths and work together toward solutions. David's phone rang as he pulled into his driveway. It was Chief Martinez. Agent Johnson, I wanted you to know that we just received our 6-month community satisfaction survey results, Martinez said. Trust in our department is up 40%, and complaints are down 60%. That's excellent news, Chief. More importantly, we haven't had a single complaint alleging racial profiling since we implemented the new training program. David smiled as he watched his children playing in the front yard. Chief, that's not just a statistic. That's families who got to go home safely instead of being subjected to what I experienced. Agent Johnson, I know I've said this before, but I want to say it again. Thank you for choosing partnership over punishment. You could have destroyed this department, but instead you helped us become better." As David hung up the phone and walked toward his house, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. Officer Blake had lost his career and was facing federal charges, but more importantly, systematic changes were preventing other officers from following his path. The incident that began with prejudice and ended with a badge revelation had become something larger. A blueprint for how communities and police departments could work together to build trust, ensure accountability, and create justice for all citizens. David's 8-year-old daughter ran up to him as he approached the front door. "Daddy, how was Grandma today?" "She was wonderful, sweetheart. She made us cookies and told us stories about when I was little." "Did you drive carefully?" David smiled and picked up his daughter. "Yes, honey. I drove very carefully." As they walked into the house together, David thought about all the families across the country who deserved the same simple pleasure of safely returning home after visiting loved ones. The work wasn't finished, but it was a start.